In the red clay hills of central Georgia, 1838, Master Richard Beaumont confronted a reality that threatened everything he had built. At 42 years old, he owned 3,000 acres of prime cotton land and commanded 200 enslaved people. But after 16 years of marriage to his wife Eleanor, he had no children. What Richard decided to do about this problem would transform Bellmont Plantation into a theater of psychological torture, where his barren wife was forced to witness the fertility denied to her manifested in the bodies of enslaved women he systematically impregnated. Richard Beaumont had married Eleanor Whitfield in 1822, a Charleston society woman who brought substantial dowry and impeccable bloodlines. They expected children would follow naturally, but year after year passed without pregnancy. By 1835, whispers had become open speculation about what was wrong with the Beaumont marriage. Eleanor endured examination by 3 different physicians, each concluding that her womb was barren. The diagnosis devastated her because in 1830s Georgia, a woman's entire value rested on her ability to produce heirs. Richard could have divorced her. Many men would have. But Eleanor's family connections remained valuable. Her dowry had been spent on plantation improvements, and divorce would invite scandal. So Richard kept his barren wife, while he devised a solution that revealed both slavery's absolute power and the psychological cruelty it enabled. Richard would father children, but not through divorce and remarriage. He would breed heirs using enslaved women, systematically and publicly, while Eleanor remained his wife. The children would be mulatto slaves, unable to inherit legally but carrying his blood forward. And Eleanor would not just tolerate this arrangement, she would witness it, manage it, become overseer of the breeding program that mockingly demonstrated the fertility her body denied him. Richard presented this plan to Eleanor in spring 1838, as if it were reasonable business rather than sustained cruelty. "We need children," he stated in a conversation Eleanor later described as the moment her marriage died. "You cannot provide them. I will not divorce you, but I will father children with appropriate slaves. You will manage the program." Eleanor understood immediately she had no recourse, no independent income, no family close enough to provide refuge. Divorce on grounds of barrenness would leave her destitute and ruined. So she agreed, but with one condition that revealed her fury and powerlessness. "If I must manage your breeding program, then you will watch as well. Every conception, every pregnancy, every birth. If you force me to see your fertility mocking my barrenness, then you will see what you are turning these women into. Breeding stock. Property." Richard agreed, perhaps understanding this was the price of cooperation, or perhaps because he was enough of a monster not to care. The first woman Richard selected was Priscilla, a 23-year-old house slave whose literacy made her valuable for managing Eleanor's household accounts. Priscilla was light-skinned, daughter of the previous master's liaison with an enslaved woman. Richard's selection was calculated. He wanted children visibly mixed race, but refined enough to demonstrate his superiority even in illegitimate offspring. Priscilla was summoned to the main house on a humid June evening and brought to Richard's study, where Eleanor sat in a corner chair. Richard informed Priscilla she would bear his children, framing rape as honor. "You have been chosen to carry forward the Beaumont bloodline. Your children will be raised in the house, educated, prepared for responsibility. This is privilege granted to few." Priscilla, who understood refusing a master's sexual demands meant punishment or sail south, nodded silently. But her eyes moved to Eleanor, searching for recognition of the horror, some acknowledgement woman to woman that this was wrong. Eleanor met her gaze and saw the question, "Are you complicit or captive?" The answer was both. Eleanor was trapped by marriage law and economic dependence, bound to witness and facilitate her husband's systematic rape. The encounters occurred in a bedroom adjacent to the main house. Richard insisted Eleanor be present, watching from her designated chair as he attempted to impregnate another woman. The psychological torture this inflicted on Eleanor was obvious and intentional. She had to witness the fertility her body denied, watch him perform intimate acts their marriage had failed to make reproductive, see another woman potentially conceive the children she desperately wanted but could not have. But the torture inflicted on Priscilla was equally profound. She was being raped while another woman watched, forced to perform conception as witnessed event, reduced to breeding stock whose value lay solely in her womb's functionality. These encounters continued twice weekly for 3 months until Priscilla's pregnancy was confirmed. Eleanor managed medical care with clinical detachment, bringing in a physician, arranging better quarters, ensuring proper nutrition. The emotional complexity of Eleanor's position defies simple categorization. She was victim of her husband's cruelty but also participant in enslaved women's dehumanization. She suffered within the system but chose to operate within it in ways that made her complicit. Priscilla gave birth to a son in March 1839. Richard named him Alexander, though he carried no surname and was recorded in plantation ledgers simply as property born to Priscilla, value estimated at $400. Within weeks of Priscilla's delivery, Richard selected his next breeding partner, Anna, a 19-year-old field slave. Anna was darker-skinned, daughter of enslaved parents with no white ancestry. Her selection revealed Richard's program was expanding beyond initial criteria. He was simply breeding, exercising power to impregnate any woman he chose. Anna's experience differed from Priscilla's in ways demonstrating slavery's violence along multiple axes. Where Priscilla had been house slave with some education, Anna had spent her life in brutal field labor. She could not read medical texts, Eleanor consulted. She was terrified in ways Priscilla had not been because Anna had no reference point except that the master wanted her body, and she had no power to refuse. Eleanor's role was identical, witness and facilitator. But her internal experience was shifting. "I have become overseer of my own torture," Eleanor wrote to her sister Sarah in Charleston. "I watch my husband create the children I cannot give him. I manage pregnancies that mock my empty womb. I ensure these women receive care to maximize reproductive success while my body remains useless for the only purpose society recognizes in women. I am both victim and perpetrator, suffering while inflicting suffering on women who have even less power than I do." Anna conceived within 2 months and delivered a daughter in January 1840. Richard named her Victoria, documenting her birth with notes about physical characteristics and potential future value. He was maintaining detailed breeding records, tracking bloodlines and traits as he would with horses or cattle. By 1841, Richard had impregnated 6 different enslaved women, producing 8 children who ranged in skin tone from nearly white to visibly black, but all unmistakably carried features revealing their paternity. The Plantation's enslaved community knew exactly what was happening, as did neighboring planters who observed unusual numbers of light-skinned children appearing at Bellmont. But this knowledge remained unspoken, because to speak, it would challenge Richard's authority. And in 1840s Georgia, a master's right to do anything with his property, including forcing them to bear his children, was absolute and unchallengeable. Eleanor's mental state deteriorated as the program expanded. She experienced what we would recognize as depression, spending hours alone, refusing social activities. Her letters to Sarah became increasingly desperate. "Today I watched him with Lila. She is barely 18, younger than I was when I married him, and he uses her body as casually as he would use a breeding mare. And I sit in my chair, required witness to fertility I will never possess, managing logistics of conception that excludes me entirely. I have become something monstrous. I am barren wife overseeing her husband's breeding program, ensuring maximum reproductive efficiency in women whose circumstances I cannot improve, and whose suffering I cannot prevent. What am I, Sarah? Victim or accomplice?" But Eleanor's letters also revealed another dimension. She had begun documenting everything in detailed records, paralleling Richard's breeding ledgers but serving different purpose. Where Richard recorded births and monetary value, Eleanor recorded the women's names, their ages when first forced into the program, dates of each encounter, medical complications, and most significantly, she recorded their own words about their experiences. Priscilla told me today she does not know whether to love or hate Alexander, Eleanor wrote in 1842. He is her son, but also the master's property, born from rape, destined for slavery despite carrying his father's blood. She said, I look at him and see both my child and my chains. How do I mother someone I cannot protect? Someone who belongs to the man who owns me. Eleanor's documentation served multiple purposes. Partly psychological survival, creating narrative order on chaotic suffering. Partly revenge against Richard, preserving evidence of his crimes should circumstances arise where it could be used. And partly bearing witness for women who had no ability to preserve their own testimonies. By 1845, Richard's breeding program had produced 17 children ranging from infant to 6 years old. All lived at Bellmont in special quarters, built for what Richard called his improvement project. They received better food, better clothing, rudimentary education preparing them for management positions within the slave system. The psychological impact on these children as they grew old enough to understand their circumstances was profound. They could see their father daily, a white man who acknowledged them only as valuable property. They could see their mothers, enslaved women who loved them but could offer no protection. The older children began asking questions with no good answers. Why does master look like us? Why does mistress watch us but never speak to us? Why are we slaves when master is our father? The women struggled to provide explanations that would not crush their children's spirits while preparing them for reality of enslavement. Priscilla tried to frame it as privilege, telling Alexander that being the master's son meant opportunities other enslaved children would never have. But Anna told Victoria blunt truth, you are slave because your mother is slave, no matter who your father is. In this system, enslaved women's children are always enslaved. Our bodies create property for our masters, and your existence proves that rule. Eleanor, watching these children grow, experienced a psychological shift her letters documented painfully. Initial resentment of children representing her reproductive failure gradually transformed into complicated maternal feelings. I find myself drawn to Victoria, Eleanor wrote in 1846. She has my husband's eyes but Anna's dignity. She is 6 years old and already understands more about this system's cruelty than I did at 26. Yesterday, she asked me why I watch but never touch her. I had no answer, so I told her truth I could manage, because I am afraid. She looked at me and said, me too. In that moment, we recognized each other as fellow prisoners in different cells of the same institution. Richard's attitude toward his mulatto children was complex. He took pride in their existence as proof of his virility and his ability to create improved stock. He invested in their education and training, but he maintained absolute emotional distance, treating them as property he had cultivated rather than children he had fathered. When Alexander, his oldest son by Priscilla, was 7 and asked Richard directly if he was his father, Richard's response was chilling. I am your master. That is the only relationship between us that matters. You carry my blood, which makes you valuable property, but you are property nonetheless. Your mother's status determines yours, and your mother is slave. Therefore, you are slave. Accept this, and your life will be comfortable within bounds available to you. Question it, and you will be sold south. The psychological impact of this rejection on a 7-year-old who could see his own father daily but never claim that relationship is impossible to fully comprehend. Alexander became withdrawn and obedient, performing the role of grateful slave while suppressing acknowledgement of the father who denied him. Eleanor's relationship with Richard deteriorated beyond salvage. By 1850, they communicated only through written notes despite living in the same house. Eleanor had moved into separate quarters. Her letters revealed she had contemplated suicide multiple times but rejected it because she felt responsibility to continue documenting the breeding program. "If I die, who will remember these women's names? Who will preserve testimony that they were human beings, not breeding stock? Who will create evidence that might someday hold Richard accountable if circumstances ever change?" Richard seemed indifferent to Eleanor's deterioration. He had what he wanted: children carrying his blood, proof of his fertility, a breeding program producing valuable property. His wife's suffering was irrelevant to these achievements. By 1855, Richard had fathered 27 children with 14 different enslaved women. His breeding program had become Bellmont's defining characteristic, known throughout the county as Master Beaumont's Improvement Project. Some neighboring planters consulted Richard about implementing similar programs, treating selective breeding of enslaved people as agricultural innovation worth emulating. The casual horror of these consultations, where men discussed forcing enslaved women to bear children as if discussing crop rotation, demonstrated how completely slavery had corrupted moral reasoning. The Civil War reached Georgia in 1864, and with it came possibility of emancipation. Richard, now 68, watched the Confederacy collapsing. In a final act of cruelty, he drafted a will acknowledging his 27 mulatto children and leaving them each $1, the minimum required to prevent them challenging his estate. The bulk of his property went to distant white cousins, ensuring children who carried his blood would receive nothing of substance. Richard died in March 1865, weeks before Union troops arrived in central Georgia. Eleanor, now 59, faced the plantation's collapse and emancipation of people she had spent nearly 3 decades watching her husband systematically rape and breed. The 27 children ranged from infants to 26-year-old Alexander. All were freed by the 13th Amendment, but freedom could not undo psychological damage of being bred as property by one's own father. Eleanor made a decision that scandalized what remained of Georgia society. She gathered the 27 young people who had been her husband's breeding program products and offered them everything she legally could. The plantation was heavily mortgaged and most property worthless in the collapsed Confederate economy, but she signed over what remained to them collectively, creating cooperative ownership arrangement impossible under slavery. "I cannot give you back childhood stolen by my husband's breeding program," Eleanor told them in a gathering. Documented by Priscilla, who had taught herself to write during slavery. "I cannot undo rape of your mother's or psychological torture of being raised as your father's property. But I can give you this place, poisoned as it is by memories, and I can finally say what I should have said 27 years ago. What my husband did was evil. What I participated in was evil. You deserved fathers who claimed you, mothers who could protect you, childhoods free from knowledge that your existence served your master's dynasty while enslaving you, absolutely. I failed you. I failed your mothers. I failed to find courage to resist when resistance might have mattered." Eleanor left Bellmont in 1866, moving to Charleston to live with sister Sarah. She never remarried, spent remaining 23 years in relative isolation, maintained correspondence with several of Richard's children until her death in 1889. Her letters, preserved by nieces and donated to Georgia Historical Society in 1952, provided extraordinary documentation of plantation breeding programs from a white woman's perspective. These letters, combined with testimonies that Priscilla and other women recorded during Reconstruction, created an unusually complete archive of one breeding program's operations. Modern historians analyzing this archive struggle with Eleanor's moral status. She was clearly victim of her husband's cruelty, forced to witness systematic rape that mocked her own sterility. But she was also clearly complicit in the system, actively managing the breeding program, facilitating encounters, providing medical care specifically to maximize reproductive success. What remains undeniable is that Richard Beaumont's breeding program produced descendants, over 300 living today, connected by DNA and documented history. Family reunions held periodically since 1985 bring together descendants of Richard's breeding program. In 2003, descendants established a memorial at the Bellmont site. The memorial reads, "Here, Master Richard Beaumont forced enslaved women to bear his children while his barren wife Eleanor watched, creating a dynasty built on systematic rape and breeding. We honor the women who survived this horror. We honor the 27 children bred as property, who bore psychological burden of having their enslaver as their father. We remember so such systems can never be reconstructed." The story of Bellmont Plantation reveals slavery's cruelty operating in multiple directions simultaneously. Richard could rape enslaved women with absolute impunity, while psychologically torturing his wife by forcing her to witness the very fertility denied to her. Eleanor, victimized by her husband, simultaneously victimized enslaved women by facilitating the system that made them breeding stock. The children grew up knowing their father but being denied any acknowledgement of that relationship. The Bellmont story challenges us to recognize that systems of oppression create no pure victims or perpetrators, only people with varying degrees of power making choices within impossible constraints. Eleanor made terrible choices within a system that offered no good options. The enslaved women survived through strategies mixing resistance and accommodation. The children navigated identities society offered no categories for. Today, Bellmont Plantation's main house stands empty, too haunted by history to use comfortably. But descendants gather periodically at the site, connected by blood created through systematic rape. They have chosen to claim all parts of their heritage, acknowledging Richard's blood, while honoring the women who bore children they could not protect, and the white woman who documented what she could not prevent. This is the legacy of Bellmont, not dynasty but testimony, not pride but witness, not continuation but memory of what should never happen again.